Lovely to see you. Shall we start?
Please go ahead, Ismail.
Okay. Good evening, dear members and guests of Poetry Society. This is our 818th meeting. Our society started in 1923. So next year we shall celebrate our centenary. We begin this meeting with a heavy heart, as we lost many members recently. They are Bala Kodandaraman, Fazal Mehdi, Dr. Subbarao, Nadira Tayyabji, and Polly Chinoy. They were indeed pillars of our society. Polly Chinoy passed away on the 18th of June. She was the oldest member of the Poetry Society and many times its president. She erudite, vibrant, she along with other members like Bilqis Alauddin, Isaac Sequeira, Bala Kodandaraman, outlines the structure of Poetry Society. These were with unique variety, grace, and charm. Let us observe for a minute silence for in remembrance of Polly Chinoy's soul to rest in peace. Thank you. Our meeting number 808 was held on the 14th of March 2019. It was our last regular meeting. Then we had to cope with restrictions of COVID and decided with President Aruna Bahuguna and Secretary Philip Joshua to have our meetings on Zoom. These proved to be popular and successful. We could attract listeners from abroad also. As the COVID situation is not over yet, we are continuing with Zoom. Today's meeting is, as I said, 818th, and we hope to continue the tradition laid down by former stalwarts. Today's meeting, the topic is Sufism. It has a global appeal and relevance. Its poems stand on the bestsellers lists in many countries of the world, from north to south, east to west. This is why we have been having at least one meeting on Sufism every year. We are fortunate to have Scott Kugle, eminent Sufi scholar at Duke University, to talk to us on Sufi poetry in Persian, Arabic, and Urdu. I first met Scott when he newly arrived in Hyderabad. And in, I think it was 1989. And then again, when we were both on the board of Henry Martin Institute, Scott was researching on interreligious dialogue and conflict resolution. And he was also working on his book on Mahalaka by Chanda called Sun and Sun Meets Moon. It is a fascinating account of the 18th century Hyderabad woman poet. His new book, Hajj to the Heart's Description, describes Sufi journeys across the Indian Ocean. Scott will introduce the speaker.
Okay. Hi, Isma. Thanks for that little introduction to Scott. Let me just begin the meeting by adding a little more information from my short conversation with Scott today. Scott has been visiting Hyderabad, I was told, from 1996, where he first came over as a doctoral student, working at the Henry Martin Institute. Since then, he's been coming on and off. And unfortunately, the COVID restricted his visits in the last few years, but a frequent visitor to Hyderabad. I just want to correct something what Ismat had mentioned. Scott is the professor in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. I think he studied at Duke. He received his PhD from Duke University in the history of religions and Islamic studies. His fields of expertise include Sufism, Islamic society in South Asia, and issues of gender and sexuality. He has conducted research in Morocco, Tunisia, India, and Pakistan, and his research languages are Arabic, Urdu, and Persian. He's the author of 8 books, and I'm told the latest of which is what Ismat just mentioned, Hajj to the Heart, Sufi Journeys Across the Indian Ocean. And this book is available online as well as in print. So having said that, I'll hand over to Scott and have Scott probably give us a little introduction in his own words about himself, his work, and then transition over to the talk for the day. Thank you, Scott.
Both Ismatji and Nikhil for that nice introduction. It's really an honor to be invited to join you all. And I hear this is the 100th year of the Poetry Society, so it's amazing the continuity of this institution and the hard work and love that many people have poured into it to keep it going. So I'm happy to be taking part. And it's good to see some old friends here, as well as many new people. I'm sure growing up in Hyderabad, most of you, or living in Hyderabad for a long time, encounter Sufism in various ways. And so I'm not going to assume that you have a prior background in Sufism. So, but for some of you, what I say may be a little bit of a unnecessary introduction. For others of you, it might be new information. So for those of you who have a little more background, forgive me. And let me see if I can get my screen share up and going. Yeah, so as our friends introduced me, I first came to Hyderabad in 1995 when I was just a kid. I was a university student starting to learn Persian. I had started studying Arabic in Egypt before I started my graduate studies, but I never had a chance to study Persian. And my university in America had a great Arabic program, but no Persian program. So my teachers said, hey, you have to go to India to learn Persian. And that struck me as strange. But once I got here and I realized what a deep history the Persian language and Persian poetry, and especially Persian Sufi poetry, has in South Asia, it made perfect sense to me. And so Persian is a deeply rooted language here in India, and the libraries that you have here in Hyderabad are what brought me to this place in the beginning, especially the Salarjung Library the AP State Oriental Manuscript Archive. I don't know what it's called anymore now that Telangana and Andhra have split. But incredible resources of Persian literature are there. And I came when I was young to try to read some Sufi texts in Persian in order to learn Persian. So that's my little introduction. And I'm going to focus on Sufi poetry in Arabic and Persian, just because that might be newer for you all. Rather than Urdu poetry, you probably have a more familiarity with Urdu poetry just from your environment. So forgive me for that. Let's see. Okay. So Sufism, let's start with how to define the term in Arabic and Persian and Urdu. The word is tasawwuf, meaning actually becoming a Sufi. And Sufis themselves have preserved many different stories and definitions of what Sufism means and where the word came from. One idea is that it comes from the word suf, which means wool. So people who wore rough woolen clothing as a sign of asceticism or giving up the pleasures of the world were called Sufi in Arabic. That's one idea. Another idea that's preserved by some Sufi writers themselves is that it comes from the Greek word Sophia, meaning wisdom, like the word philosophy, the love of wisdom. So people who dedicated their lives to pursuing wisdom rather than money or power or fame were called Sufi because they pursued Sophia. And of course, a lot of words in Arabic came from Greek. The Arabs conquered areas which were part of Greek civilization. So that's a possible origin for the word Sufi. Another theory is that it comes from the word safwa, or purity, right? Like we have in Urdu, the word saf sutra. So Sufis were those who purified their heart through meditation or through devotional practices. So you can think of it as a kind of mysticism, maintaining the purity of the heart. And that's where the word Sufi came from. There's one last definition, which I think is probably the correct one historically, and that is it comes from the word sofa, which is the word for a bench. We got our word in English sofa from this term. It's a kind of a bench that you could sleep on or sit on. And the Prophet Muhammad, when he built the first mosque in Medina, had a bench built into the mosque where people could sit and congregate. And some people liked to sit there so much that they gave up their houses and moved there and decided they wanted to live at the mosque full time. And they might have been known as the Ahle Safa, or the people of the bench. And later the term Sufi was popularized as people who followed in their path. So those are four competing ideas that all build up into a composite picture of who Sufis were. But as they gained popularity and social prestige in the Islamic world, Sufis began to not only practice mysticism, meditation, but also write and sing poetry. So poetry became one of the primary literary expressions of Islamic mysticism or Sufism. And the first expressions of Sufi poetry, of course, were in Arabic, because the earliest Muslims were Arab speakers. And the first one I'll share with you is by a famous woman, Rabia of Basra. Her actual name was Rabia al-Adawiyya, and people know of her as Rabia Basriya or Rabia of Basra. And she's one of the most famous female Sufis, and is one of the first Sufis to really combine asceticism, a rejection of the world, with love of God. And so the poem, I present two poems of hers for you that I've translated. And I'll read it a little bit in Arabic so you can hear the rhyme and the cadence, and then we can look at the English meaning of it. أحبك حبين حب الهواء وحب لأنك أهلا لذاك فأما الذي هو حب الهواء فشغلي بذكرك عما سواك. So that's the opening two lines. And you can hear that it rhymes pretty strongly at the end of each line with the sound aka, lidaka, siwaka, and you'll hear that rhyme all throughout the poem. The English translation I have there, you can read it along with me. I love you with two loves. Uhibbuka hubayni. I love you with two loves, the love of desire and another love that is deserved by you. And of course, the you in most Sufi poetry is the beloved, meaning especially God. But there's some ambiguity in Sufi poetry about whether the beloved could be a human being or an ideal of beauty or would be the deity itself. So here, Rabia is expressing her love for God, saying that it's actually two loves, a love of desire, of hawa, and a love that is deserved by God. In the next line, she explains a little more. فَأَمَّا الَّذِي هُوَ حُبُّ الْهَوَاءِ فَشُغْلِي بِذِكْرِكَ عَنْمَا سِوَاكَ. As for the love of desire, it distracts me in my remembering you from all other than you. And it continues, and as for the love that is deserved by you, it is your lifting each veil until I clearly see you. There is no praise for me in that love or this, rather, for both loves all praise belongs to you. وَأَمَّا الَّذِي أَنْتَ أَهْلٌ لَهُ فَكَشْفُكَ لِلْحَجَبِ حَتَّى أَرَاكَ فَلَا الْحَمْدُ فِي ذَا وَلَا ذَاكَ لِي وَلَكِنَّ لَكَ الْحَمْدُ فِي ذَا وَذَاكَ. And in this, Rabia is introducing a theme which is continuous throughout Sufi poetry, the idea of lifting veils, the idea that worldly life, worldly desires are veils which prevent us from seeing God's presence clearly. And if the veils would be lifted, we would find ourselves in the presence of God continuously, or we would find that God is within each of us because our existence is given and renewed continuously with each breath by God. So this idea of veils that prevent us from seeing the beloved, but they're veils that can be lifted, is a theme that goes through Arabic, Persian, and then Urdu, Sufi poetry. There are two more couplets to this poem, and then we can move on. Rabia then writes, when I found that my heart was devoid of anything but you, I filled it with your love. Then I was entirely filled with you until no space in me was free for any other than you. وَلَمَّا عَلِمْتُ بِأَنَّ قَلْبِي فَارِغٌ مِمَّا سِوَاكَ مَلَأْتُهُ بِهَوَاكَ وَمَلَأْتُ كُلِّي مِنْكَ حَتَّى لَمْ أَدْعَ مِنِّي مَكَانًا خَالِيًا لِسَوَاكَ. That's the beauty of Rabia and her poetry. Here's another one that's maybe a little more conventional. And in this one, I was able to translate it in English with a rhyme that tries to mimic or imitate the rhyme scheme in the Arabic. She writes, Rahati ya ikhwati fi khalwati wa habibi da'iman fi hadrati. Lam ajid li an hawahu iwadan wa hawahu fil baraya mihnati. حيثما كنت أشاهد حسنه فهو محرابي إليه قبلتي. So she says, I find peace in isolation, my brothers. What else to say? For continually my beloved in my presence does stay. I find no substitute to replace passionate love for him, and this passion is my trial in human company's fray. Wherever I witness his beauty's manifestation serves as my devotion's niche. In that direction I pray. And in that last couplet, she uses the words mihrab and qibla. And for those of you familiar with Islamic prayer and mosque architecture, of course, the mihrab is the niche in the mosque that the imam stands in front of, and the qibla is the direction facing Mecca that one praise to. In this poem, I translated the word for God, the pronoun, as his, because in Arabic it is pretty insistent that the word huwa, or his, be used. Although in Arabic, huwa can also stand for any abstract idea as well as a living person. When you say he or she in Arabic, it is the equivalent also of it. There's no separate pronoun it in Arabic. There's no neuter gender. So translators face a big challenge in translating Sufi poetry from Arabic, because you have to choose whether to say his or its for referring to the divine or to God. And Sufis, of course, insist that Allah is not a masculine person, and yet the Arabic language insists on using the word huwa for God, or he. So you can see translators, face, especially ones sensitive to gender equality, face an uphill battle in translating Sufi texts from Arabic. Persian, of course, doesn't have that particular problem. And I wanted especially to include these poems by Rabia, not only because she was a female poet and a famous figure in Sufism and an early poetic voice, but also because she lived in Iraq. And so this is my thanks to Ismat Mehdi for inviting me. She'd spent some time in Iraq, as most of you know, and I wanted to make sure that there were voices from Iraq present. Let's see, how am I doing on time? When I have the, Nikhil, you can help me. When I have the display going on my computer, I can't see the clock.
You're doing well, Scott. It's 7:20, but don't worry about the clock. We're enjoying this talk so far.
All right. So, so much for Arabic. The earliest expressions of Islamic mysticism were in Arabic, but by the 11th century, in not only Iran, but the wider Central Asian and South Asian world, Persian was emerging as a dominant language. And Persian absorbed so many words as well as a script from Arabic. And Persian really transformed from its engagement with Arabic into what we now know of as medieval and modern Persian. And of course, Firdausi, a great poet who wrote the Shahnameh, lived in this era. He was in the court of Mahmud of Ghazna, one of the first to invade South Asia and India. We also have Baba Tahir Orian, who wrote rubaiyat, or quatrains, a particular form of poetry. I'll give you an example of that coming up. He's about the earliest Sufi mystical poet we know of in the Persian language. And then we have Sadi from Shiraz, who wrote Persian ghazals, or love lyrics, and that's a form that I'll also talk about in a moment. And of course, Maulana Rumi's Mystical Lessons, a long, long poem in the Masnavi form, which is an epic poetry form with a different rhyme scheme where you can go on and on forever. And Maulana Rumi, once he got going with this long Masnavi Ma'anvi, or mystical epic, he went on for 6 books. And I believe that Ismat Mehdi has given you a talk in the past on Maulana Rumi, so I don't want to spend too much time repeating what she said. Instead, I wanted to focus on the Persian poetry that was written here in India, especially by Chishti Sufis. And Nizamuddin Aulia in Delhi was the great leader who oversaw the spread of the Chishti order all throughout India and even down here into the Deccan. This is a picture of him, an imaginary portrait of him in a miniature painting. Nizamuddin Aulia, in his Persian book Fawaid al-Fu'ad, or Morals for the Heart, loves to quote poetry from the Sufi tradition that he inherited. And one of the people he loved to quote was Qazi Hamid-ud-Din Nagori, who's buried in Mehrauli outside of Delhi. And this is a great example of a quatrain, a very pithy form of poetry, only 4 lines. That's why it's called a rubai, from the word 4, raba'a in Arabic. And this one is beautiful in its thought and simple in its language. On aql kuja ke dar kamal tu rasad. و آن روح کجا که در جلال تو رسد. گیرم که تو پرده برگرفتی ز جمال، آن دیده کجا که در جمال تو رسد. The meaning is, where is the mind to grasp your sovereignty? Again, the Sufi poet is speaking to God as tu, as you. Where is the mind to grasp your sovereignty? Where is the soul to mirror your majesty? Beauty's face I know you could unveil, but where are the eyes to behold your beauty? And forgive me, there's a little spelling mistake there. But where are eyes to behold your beauty? The meaning of the meaning of the poem is that God's beauty is everywhere. It's actually already unveiled to us in our own existence, but our eyes are not accustomed to seeing it. We don't have the proper eyes to see God's beauty unveiled. And of course, Sufi practices like dhikr, meditation, muraqabah, or different kinds of concentration exercises, or even listening to this poetry sung in music and qawwali, were all ways to try to change one's vision, to lift those veils of obscuring distraction that keeps one from recognizing God's presence in everything. So that's a great example of a rubai, or a quatrain. Because this is the Poetry Society, you might want to write your own quatrains, so you can focus on the structure here. The structure of the rubai is simple. The first line sets a rhythm, and it rhymes with a, some sound. The next line echoes the rhythm, and it rhymes with a, the same rhyme. The third line varies the rhythm, and it must never rhyme with a. And the fourth line repeats the rhythm and rhymes with a. If we go, I don't know if I can go back. Anyway, you can remember the sound of that rubai I read to you and see this structure. The ghazal is a different poetic form, one that you may be more familiar with because the ghazal has turned into a popular song form, of course, with a big revival in the past several decades. Most people think of it as a romantic music, but Sufis adapted it to being not just about erotic love, but being about divine love as well. The ghazal starts like a quatrain, but then the rhyme extends to many more couplets. Anywhere from 5 couplets to 21 couplets constitutes a ghazal. And Amir Khusro is the great Indian Chishti Sufi poet who tried to imitate Sadi. His teacher Nizamuddin Aulia, his Sufi master, said to Amir Khusro, "Why don't you write in the style of Sadi?" And Sadi's style was sweet and eloquent and full of love. And so Amir Khusro took that up as a challenge. And I'll give you a ghazal of his in Persian, couplet by couplet, and you can see what kind of translation I worked on with it. And we'll see at the final couplet, the writer, in this case Khusro, has to use his takhallus, or his chop, as you might say in Hindi, the stamp of closing with his own name. So we'll see that in the final couplet. The poem reads, Guftam ke roshan az qamar, gufta ke rukhsare manast. Guftam ke shirin az shakar, gufta ke guftare manast. The translation might be, what's as luminous as the moon, I asked. She said, the glow of my cheek. What's as sweet as sugar, I asked. She said, the words that I speak. And this structure of I asked, she said, is going to be continuous throughout the whole ghazal, as we'll see. I translated the beloved here as she, but actually it's very ambiguous in Persian. There is no he or she or it in Persian. It's all represented by one pronoun, u. So a thing, a person, a man, a woman, or God are all represented by the same pronoun in Persian. And that's the same as Urdu, using the word vo, right? But in Urdu, then the verb has to be conjugated to a gender. But in Persian, that's not the case. If I said he ran and she ran, it would sound exactly the same in Persian. So Persian is a wonderfully ambiguous language, and Sufis loved that because they could play with the different nuances of love, and you could never tell whether they were talking about a human beloved, male or female, or God. Let's look at the next couplets to this poem. Khusro continues, Guftam tariqe ashiqan, gufta wafadari buvad. Guftam makun jawro jafa, gufta ke inkar manast. And so you can hear the same insistent rhyme in the ghazal. In this case, it's the sound are manast at the end of every couplet. The English meaning is, how to be your lover, I asked. She said, just unfailing fidelity. You won't oppress me, I asked. She said, I've no business being meek. Guftam ke marge nagahan, gufta ke darde hijre man, guftam ke ilaje zindagi, gufta ke didare manast. Why does sudden death come, I asked. She said, severe separation from me. And which cure restores life, I asked. She said, my face when you catch a peek. Guftam ke huriya pari, gufta ke man shahe butan, guftam ke khusro na tavan, gufta ke paristare manast. Are you an angel or a fairy, I asked. She said, I'm the lord of enchanting idols. Khusro is too weak, I implored. She said, now you worship me whom you seek. And there in this last couplet, you can hear that Khusro uses his own name, his takhallus, and that's necessary when you're closing a ghazal. Khusro is too weak, I implored. She said, now you worship me who you seek. And that's the final sort of climax message of the ghazal, is only when you admit that you're too weak to deserve love from the beloved do you actually sincerely worship the one you've been searching for. So that's a great example of a ghazal. The structure you can see if you want to try to write your own, and you can write ghazals in English as well as Urdu. When I teach in Atlanta, I sometimes have my students write a ghazal in English, and it's surprising how well they can do. So there are some Indian poets as well who've been writing ghazals in English. Agha Shahid Ali, who passed away within this last decade, was probably the most famous. He was a Kashmiri poet who specialized in writing ghazals in English. So the structure is that the first couplet's line rhymes with a, which is some sound. In this case, it was are manast. The first couplet's next line rhymes with a. The second couplet's first line has no rhyme. The second couplet's next line rhymes with a. The third couplet's first line has no rhyme. The third couplet's next line rhymes with a. And one continues this as long as you can sustain it until the final couplet, when the first couplet's line names the takhallus, or the name of the poet, and the final couplet's line rhymes with a, closing the whole ghazal off. Let me just read you a translation of a ghazal that is attributed to Muinuddin Chishti. So some of the great Sufi teachers actually wrote poetry in a very mystical mode, very theological. The ghazal that I shared for you from Khusro is kind of playful, right? It's about love. But this one is much more Sufi-esque, I guess you could say, in that it really deals with deep issues in Islamic theology. I won't read the whole poem in Persian for you, but the first line goes, Andar ayane jan akse jamal didam, hamchun khorshid dar abe zulal didam. The translation, something like this: I see the reflection of his beauty in my soul's mirror, just like I see the blazing sun reflected in a pool of pure still water. The gaze of reason is stunned by one ray of my beloved's face. I see his image despite the obscuring of 100 veils. The light shining from my soul's mirror is of the essence. I see it, however, as a metaphor representing the truth. And here the word truth is al-haq, which is one of the names of God. That's another challenge for translating this poetry into English, is al-haq means both the truth, the reality, and God. But in English, you can't put all of those together. You have to choose a word. The poem continues, "Let me be excused for acting so bewildered and drunk. I see his beauty and goodness in my amazement's mirror." And here Muinuddin Chishti introduces a theme that you find, and it perplexes people in Sufi poetry, the idea of drinking wine, being drunk, being bewildered and confused, not acting in conventional ways. Of course, the image of wine is an old and deep metaphor for God's love, which one drinks deeply and makes one drunk, not necessarily drinking alcohol. He continues, "I am a drunken lover since I heard the words, 'Am I not your Lord?' I see reason and intelligence as an impossibility for me. My being is gone, and all that's left is his absolute being. I see all this as exile endured in hopes of some future union. Through a painful narrowness, I've entered the party of oneness. I see nothing as impossible after passing through such an ordeal. In the expanse of all is he, this whole world and cosmos, I see as less than a crowing cock, unable to even fly. Since Muin left phenomena's dust for eternity's light, I see no impending dawn and no sunset and no high noon." And there, in the final couplet, you again find the takhallus, right? The poet's naming himself, using the name Muin. And this comes from a whole divan of Persian poetry called Divan-e-Muin. It's attributed to Muinuddin Chishti, although there's some debate among Sufi scholars whether Muinuddin Chishti actually wrote these poems or whether it was another person named Muin that legend sort of remembers as being Muinuddin Chishti. I have no definitive statement on this, except to say that in Ajmer Sharif, when you go there, the Qawwals sing these ghazals. This one that I've translated for you, I've heard sung there, and they insist that it is Muinuddin Chishti's own poetry. So you could say that there's an oral tradition, even if the written tradition is not 100% certain. And finally, let me close with one poem that we know is attributed to a great Sufi teacher, and that is Nizamuddin Awliya. Nizamuddin Awliya, in fact, this is the only poem of his that he wrote that we have, and we know it's from him. It's a salam. So this is a particular kind of poem. It's in the ghazal form, but it has a particular meaning, and that's why it's called a salam. It's bearing greetings of love and devotion to the Prophet, where he's buried in Medina. And it goes like this: Sabah basuye Medina rukun, azin duagu salam barkhan. Begirde shah rusul begardo besad tarwazu salam barkhan. Turn toward Medina, O morning breeze, and convey salams from one who offers this petition. With 100 humilities, render his salam to that king of all sent on prophetic mission. And here I've tried to preserve a bit of the poem's rhyme by rhyming petition with mission, and you'll hear that sound repeated in the other couplets. Basho was man surate misali namaz biguzar andar anja be lahne khush Surah Muhammad tamam andar qiyam barkhwan. Burning with passion like mine, make your prayer in the best obedient style, then recite a chapter called Muhammad in your most melodious rendition. And here the poet is speaking to the breeze, the morning breeze, which is blowing from India across the ocean to Medina, and saying, "O breeze, carry with you these words of mine, this salam, and present it there in Medina." And Nizamuddin is saying to the breeze, you should recite the Surah Muhammad. There's a surah, a chapter in the Quran, which is called Muhammad. And recite it with your most melodious voice. He's personifying the breeze here. And then he almost gives a tour of Medina, saying to the breeze where it should go. Bibab rahmat gahi guzar kun, bibab Jibril geh jabin sa. Salam Rabbi ala Habibi, gahi bibab salam bar khan. Passing the door of mercy, bowing at the door of Gabriel, then at the door of peace, give divine salams from me to the Prophet of God. That's your commission. These doors are all doors to the Prophet's tomb in Medina. He then goes on, with impeccable respect, lay your willing head down in the dust of that alleyway. Give copious salams to the pure spirit of that exemplar of the human condition. And finally, with the takhallus, the closing couplet of this ghazal, with a harmony like the psalmist David, with a heart infused with pain and longing, in the Prophet's court, sing this poem of Nizam, his servant steeped in sins of omission. Belahne Dawood, ham nawa sho, benawle dard, ashna sho, bebazme payghambar in ghazal ra, az abde asi Nizam bar khan. So that's the only poem that we know of for sure that Nizamuddin wrote himself. He quoted other people's poetry copiously. And this is what it looks like in an old lithograph publication from the 1930s. It's a Qawwal songbook called Naghamat-e-Sama, or the Melodies of Sama. It's a collection of only Persian poetry written by poets from Iran, some from Central Asia, but most from South Asia. And it's a practical songbook that the Qawwals would use to sing. And this salam that I just translated for you is actually sung every evening in Delhi at night when the Dargah of Nizamuddin, when they close the doors for the night, they sing this song as a special ritual of closing the doors of the Dargah. So I'm pretty sure that this poem is authentically passed down from Hazrat Nizamuddin Awliya because it's sung by the Qawwals, who are the hereditary custodians and singers of that place. All right, let's stop there. I had other poems to share with you, but that turns out to be a lot when we try to read it in Persian and Arabic as well as English. And I want to leave time, of course, to hear your reactions and observations and field any questions, if I can, that you might have.
Nikhil, can I ask a question, please?
Please go ahead. I invite everyone to unmute and turn your cameras on as well if you're going to be asking any questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Scott, I just wanted to ask you, the Golconda tombs, the Qutub Shahi tombs, which are here outside the fort, if you have visited them, there are a lot of writings all over the tombs. Most of them, of course, are verses from the Quran. But one guide was telling me that some of them are in Persian and they are Sufi, I don't know if they're couplets or quatrains or what, but it's Sufi poetry. I was wondering if you have come across, if you've been to the tombs and if you've noticed these.
I certainly have been to the tombs. There are others who may be better equipped to answer that question, though. My understanding, and I have gone in and actually lifted up the chadars and looked at the beautiful carving that's on the tombs. You know, the Qutub Shahi kings were Shia Muslims. So their relationship to Sufism was a little bit complicated. Most Sufis were Sunni Muslims, but that's a different story. The Qutub Shahi kings found a way to cooperate with Sunni Muslims who were Sufis in the Qutub Shahi times. But most of the carving that's actually on the tombs, on the black stone, which is the tomb itself, it's usually the Ayat al-Kursi from the Quran, the famous verse of protection, the throne verse. And very often it's the names of the 14 imams that are revered in Shiism. the 12 Imams and plus the Prophet Muhammad and his daughter Fatima. So I don't know of any Sufi poetry in Persian that's actually written on the tombs. But maybe Sajjad Shahid, if he's here in the audience, knows more, or others who may have done research on the Qutb Shahi tombs itself.
Thank you.
Sajjad, do you have any observation on that?
I have an observation.
Yeah, I don't think there are any Persian verses as such. I don't think there are.
Ismaji, what did you have to
Yeah,
I
not
don't think there
not
are Persian verses, at least
I can't.
not Sufi verses.
Yeah, I don't know about Golconda, but in Bidar, I found some Sufi, yeah, a lot of Sufi poetry. And this is has come from an Algerian Sufi mystic whom the Bidar kings liked and wanted and invited, and they came to Khalilullah. Actually, he came to Bidar, and some of the poems are from this Abu Madian. So I don't know whether you have seen those inscriptions on the Bidar tombs.
Yes. Now the Bidar kings, of course, were before the Qutb Shahis,
Yeah.
and the kings of Bidar were Sunni, and so they had a different kind of relationship with Sufis. And you're right, they did call some Sufis from outside of India to come and settle, especially Shah Nimatullah Wali from Iran, from Kirman, and there are many verses of Shah Nimatullah Wali in the dome, written in calligraphy of Ahmad Shah in Bidar. Khalilullah, in that octagonal shaped tomb that's in Bidar, was Nimatullah Shah Wali's grandson, I believe, because Nimatullah Shah Wali didn't come to India despite being invited, but he sent his grandson instead. But I don't know about you're saying that there are poems of Abu Madian from Tlemcen in Algeria that are written inside Khalilullah's tomb. I don't know about that. It could be.
No, because
There is a full ghazal written in Ali Barit's tomb in the spandrels. A full ghazal, I think, 16 couplets, 4 on each face, internal face of the tomb. And of course, Scott, our favorite couplet on Rangeen Masnad Nasheen Bazm kya hai? Masnad Nasheen is written on Rangeen Mahal door.
And of course, the in Bidar, inside the fort, if you go there, the Rangeen Mahal, which is that interior room, which is so beautifully decorated with black stone that had been inlaid with mother of pearl calligraphy. All of those mother of pearl calligraphy, it's not inscriptions, what's the right word? When you inlay stone in stone. Those are all Persian poetic couplets. Not necessarily Sufi, but I don't know that we know who are the authors of those poems, but they're poems about love and about pearls. So it's a beautiful visual example, though. If you ever go out to Bidar, and I encourage all of you, if you haven't taken that trip, it's an easy day trip from Hyderabad, and go out to the Rangeen Mahal and see that beautiful inlay work. Although many people have chipped all the, pried all the mother of pearl out, you can still see the carved stone where it was set, and imagine what it might have looked like.
Scott, could you please share with us where are the other locations here in India for Sufi poetry that we might be able to explore, just like you mentioned about Bidar just now?
Well, the easiest thing to do is to go to the Dargah of Yusufain on Thursday nights and listen to Qawwali there. Many of the poems that they sing are in Urdu, but many of them are also in Persian. So qawwals have kept alive the tradition of Persian Sufi poetry by singing.
Okay.
And yeah, and many of the people who go there actually know the poems in Persian, even if they don't understand
Okay.
Persian as a language. They know the poetry, and that's even more true if you go to some of the more prestigious dargahs, like in Gulbarga. If you go for the Urs in Gulbarga Sharif, it just happened actually last week or a week and a half ago. I'm
Oh,
not sure the
okay.
exact date. But there are 3 days of qawwali in the evenings, and many, many Persian poems are sung. So that's one way to hear it sung, in a living tradition. And of course, YouTube is there, so you don't have to go to a dargah. You can explore on
Okay.
YouTube. Um,
True, true.
many of the poems that qawwals sing are in Persian.
I think Dr. Samina Ali just mentioned something in the chat. Perhaps you could ask the question or mention what you were saying to Scott directly. Dr. Samina Ali?
Hi there. I'm a novice at this Sufi poetry. But then, I guess even I have seen some of the Sufi poetry in the Khaja Bande Namaz Dargah in Gulbarga.
Mhm.
So when the question was asked regarding where the other locations, I just thought I might chip in. That's it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're Samina ji, you're talking about inside the dome.
Yes, I think I've seen it there because, I did my dentistry in Gulbarga and we used to go to the Dargah pretty often. So I've seen the Sufi calligraphy out there. Very beautiful.
I think it's just begun to rain.
Yeah.
It has.
Yeah.
Can hear the thunder. Yes.
That's marvelous.
Very good.
That's really wonderful. So yeah, and it's very common in a Sufi dargah for Quranic inscriptions or Quranic quotations to be written in calligraphy in the dome. But then you
Yes.
have to look at the band on which the dome sits. There's normally a band architecturally that goes around, and like a barrel, and in that you will often find oblong-shaped brackets with a Persian couplet written in it. So yeah, Sufi poetry is often used in the architecture, and sometimes you can differentiate visually between the Arabic script, which is used for the Quran, and the Persian script, which is done in a different style when it's poetry. So even visually, there's sometimes a differentiation between what's from the Quran and what's from Sufi poetry. So that even if you don't know the language, you can recognize the style of writing and know that it's, okay, this is a Persian poem, that's Arabic from the scripture. Have any of you ever written ghazals? I'm curious. In any language?
I thought you would end with a qawwali.
Oh,
Yeah.
All I can say is that the poem that I translated for you by Khusro,
Yeah.
the ghazal, that's sung in qawwali. And so is the poem of Nizamuddin's that I ended with.
Mhm.
So you can look those up on YouTube and you can find really great artists have recorded it.
But why is the form of qawwali so much in the subcontinent, and we don't really find it in other places so much? Not in the Middle East, at least not in the Arab countries. In the Iraq, I didn't find so much of qawwali.
Well, I don't have any experience in Iraq, so I can't speak to that. But the problem is, especially from India, most people's experience of the Arab world is the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Dubai, Kuwait. You don't find a tradition of Sufi singing very strong in these places. That's because the Wahhabi movement, which influenced the governments there, has stamped it out. So you have to go to other places in the Arab world. Ismatji, you mentioned Algeria. So in North Africa, whether it's Algeria or Morocco, there are very strong traditions of Sufi singing. It's not called qawwali. It's called alate Andalusi, Andalusian music. But the poetry is all in Arabic from Sufi poets. But the style of music is very different. If you heard it, you wouldn't say, "Oh, this is like qawwali." No, it's the musical style comes from what was the music in the Andalusian Spanish Arab court, with violins and little drums, and the music is completely different. But it's a kind of presentation of Sufi poetry. In Egypt, you have a strong tradition. It's called the Inshad, or the Munshidin are the singers. And they have their own kind of folk inspired rendition of Sufi poetry. Usually done just with one person, maybe a flute in the background and a tambourine. There's a great artist, a singer named Ahmed Tuni from a town called Tuna in the Nile Delta in Egypt. If you look him up, Ahmed Tuni, Tuni, you can find him in YouTube as well. He's blind, completely blind. He's this little tiny old man who's blind, and you think that he's completely incapable of anything until he picks up a tambourine and he starts to sing. It's electrifying. So that's all a tradition of Arab Sufi music. But the musical style is quite different. It's not the complicated rhythms and the choral kind of singing that developed in qawwali. That's a particular gift, of Indian and Pakistani Sufis to the rest of the world. Nobody sings qawwali like folks here.
Aruna, I think your audio is muted.
No, I was just wanting to say that Scott was asking about anyone writing in English. We had one of our members, Mona. Is Mona here today? I don't know if she's here, but no. She had written some ghazals in English, which she once read one or two to us at a meeting.
Very good, very good. And did they rhyme like the ghazal? That's hard in English.
There was some kind of rhyming. I don't remember the pattern now, but yeah, she did read a few of us.
Anyway, so that's a challenge I put to all of you who are listening. If you take it up, try to write a ghazal in English. Even if it's only 5 couplets, it counts.
But the beauty of Persian, you cannot get in English. Or the beauty of Arabic or of Urdu. A ghazal has to be with the meter and the rhyme of the original. It cannot be translated, I think. I'm very conservative about that. So I think, Scott, we have to thank you very much. But before I hand over to Aruna to give the vote of thanks, I would like to say that thanks to Avadesh Rani, you have come to us today, because we were wondering whom to call for our first session this year. And Avadesh said that you are in Hyderabad. So I said, well, we have to have you. So thank you very much. And may I ask Aruna to give the vote of thanks?
Yeah, thank you, Ismat. Scott, I think that was a wonderful start for the year for us, for the Poetry Society. Unfortunately, our time, I think, was too short. And you have really left us longing for more, which I think is what Sufi poetry also talks about. You started, I lead a very retired life, and you started with the bench, and I think I could relate to the love of the sofa. And thank you for starting with the lady poet, with Rabia. And the insights that you gave us are something which really impressed, especially when you spoke about there not being a gender. I think this is very important for us to realize, when we try to put the concept of God into a box, a human box, it really is not possible. So this trying to give a shape or a form or a gender to God is something which is very important for us to understand. And the explanations which you gave us, the structure of the different forms of poetry. That was important. And then, like you said, in translation, we lose a lot of the actual essence of what is being
Nuance.
said. So like you said, like al-haq could be truth, it could be reality, it could be God. So thank you for telling us that. And also the image of wine. I've always wondered about this, so much of wine in this poetry. So now that you said it's actually a metaphor for God's love. Thank you so much for this talk today. I think it was really enlightening. And all of us who we know just the very basics of Sufism. In fact, whenever I go for a kawali, I like to sit next to Ismat or Sajid so that they can translate and give you the real meaning. There is so much depth to it. Thank you very much, and we look forward to having more of you in the Poetry Society. And thank you to all the members. Thank you, Ismat, for organizing today, and Nikhil, of course, for always getting us online onto Zoom. Thank you, everyone, our guests also who are not members. Thank you for being with us today.
Before we close the meeting, if anybody would like to say anything, we just leave it open for a few minutes.
I wanted to say something. I am a poet and I write in English, but Urdu is my mother tongue. And when I was a teenager, I used to write ghazals in Urdu. But since I'm not practicing the takhti anymore, I am out of the practice. But I will also say that when I write in Urdu and when I write in English, because I write in English also, which is the language of my work, I don't think the way I think in Urdu, I can convey the same way, especially in terms of a ghazal or a rubai, in the same way in English. And that has been quite a challenge. And I'm a fan of Agha Shahid Ali. I love his ghazals, but somewhere I find some kind of tension, as if something more could have been there, something more that is left unsaid, but perhaps this is what poetry does. And this is how you take it forward, both as a reader and as a writer of the craft.
Thank you very much. So thank you again, Scott.
No, I just want to ask Scott to say a few words about Mahlaka Bai Chanda's story. What inspired you and how? Can you tell us something about Moon Meets Sun?
So yeah, what Ismatji is referring to is some work that I did on Mahlaka Bai Chanda, the famous woman who was a political figure as well as a poet here in Hyderabad. And the work had two aspects. One was to try to preserve her tomb out at Mola Ali at the foot of the hill. And that was a project that was a cooperative endeavor between the Deccan Studies Center with Avdesh Rani Bawa being a great participant and a helper, and of course Sajjad Shahid working alongside me and others, and along with MESCO, the Muslim Educational, Social, Educational, what's it actually called, Sajjad? Help. MESCO, a Muslim Educational, Cultural, and Social Organization of Hyderabad. They were also very, very helpful in working on that project, and it was funded by the State Department of the U.S., which was a strange thing. But the the American consulate here in Hyderabad was kind of new at that time, and was looking for cultural heritage projects to fund. And the fact that Malaka Bai was a politician as well as a female poet and educator made her a very attractive personality for the State Department when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State of the US. So we got a nice grant to actually preserve the garden and the architecture of her tomb that she built for her mother out at Mola Ali. And I encourage all of you, if you haven't taken a trip out there, to go there and visit Malaka Bai's tomb as well as go up on the hill. The other aspect of the work which was a more individual one, was translating Malakabai's poems. She wrote 125 ghazals, very short ones. They each only had 5 couplets in Urdu. But she's one of the earliest female poets in Urdu to complete divan of poems. And a divan means that you write a ghazal ending with at least one poem ending with the rhyme word in each letter of the Urdu alphabet. So that's a big challenge, especially when some of the letters are kind of rare ones like Ghain or Zoe, right? So that's what makes a complete divan rather than just a set of poems. And Malakabai wrote a complete divan. There's another woman poet who competes with her for the laurels, for the prize of being the earliest female poet. She was also from the Deccan. Her name was Lutfanisa Imtiaz. They published their divans in the same year. So which one came first? Don't know. But yeah, her poems were very interesting in that she used a lot of Sufi imagery, in that her poetry teacher was a Sufi, a Chishti from Hyderabad, who's Tajalli Ali Shah was his name. But Malakabai herself belonged to a Shi'i family, Ithna Ashari Shi'i family. So there's a lot of imagery about Imam Ali and Bibi Fatima and Hassan and Hussein, the members of the Prophet's family that are revered by Shia folks, in her poetry. So it's an interesting mix between, has a Shiite flavor, but many images from the Sufi tradition integrated in her poems. So that was interesting to work on.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
And of course, there was.
It's interesting that you spoke about being in administration too, because I think the Sufis played a very important role in, like they influenced the Mughals, influenced various kings across countries and times too.
Well, that's a tough question about whether Sufis influenced kings or kings influenced Sufis. Of course, kings donated a lot of money and land grants to the families of great Sufis, and kings donated the money to build the big domes and the architecture that we find. So there was a kind of cooperation, but also some criticism. Sufis were some of the people who could speak out to the king on behalf of the common people. They had license to criticize policies that maybe other people in court didn't have. So yeah, Sufis played a kind of mediating role, you could say, between the population and the kings.
There's this belief that they had conquered time and space, and they used to tell the Mughals, especially Aurangzeb, there is a lot of these stories how the Sufi saints would tell the king wherever he was that if a situation was developing, like say a rebellion or a famine was going to happen, so that the emperor could preempt and take action before it happened. These are of course just conjectures, nothing to do with, but beliefs that people have about Sufi saints.
Well, they often played the role of kingmaker, I guess you could say, conveying legitimacy on a king by blessing him, especially when there was a conflict between different people in the royal family over who should become king. Very often, Sufis played a deciding role in that. And here in the Deccan, Hazrat Gisudaraz, who's buried at Gulbarga, his story is very interesting that way, because he predicted that one person would become the king, and it wasn't the one that the present king of his sons, it wasn't the one that was favored. And so there developed a conflict between the king and his desire and the Sufi and his prediction. But that's the story about how, Hussein Shah Wali, how Ahmad Shah, who's known as Ahmad Shah Wali, became the king at Bidar. because of the intervention or the prediction of this Chishti teacher, Gisudaras. But that's a different story. But you're right. There are many stories of political conflict woven into the legends about various Sufi figures here in the Deccan, as well as North India. All right.
So thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, everyone. We've gone a little bit past our normal time. So thank you, everybody, for participating. Goodbye. Good night.
Thank you and good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Scott.
sir. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Great to see everybody here. It's so nice to be back. I can't tell you.
Yeah.
It was 3 long years of separation and COVID. The government canceled all visas, so we in the US and abroad were not able to come back and visit or do anything. So it was tough on everybody. But yeah, stay vigilant. It's not over.
Thank you. Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Thank you, everyone.